Father of modern linguistics, one of the most prominent public intellectuals, Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you for joining us. In this session, we have a group of journalists, academics, and activists, primarily from Lebanon. We have a colleague from Syria as well. We're having this discussion just before the US elections on Tuesday, November 3rd. And this is why basically we'll be dividing this session to address the impact of Trump's 4 years of presidency on both domestic politics and foreign policy. So if I may start with a question about the impact that Trump's presidency had on the rise of the far right and the rise of societal tensions in the United States. Would you say that the past 4 years exposed deeply rooted problems and cultural divisions in the United States, or would you rather say that what we're currently witnessing is trivial and could be easily overcome by another administration?
I think that Trump very skillfully drew some of the poisons that are latent in American society and have been for a long time. In fact, since its origins, he drew them to the surface. He's turned them into a major force. It's a poison that's going to be very hard to eradicate. If you look at Trump's support, there are two sectors. One is the support of the corporate sector, which he serves slavishly. I mean, the entire legislative program is gifts to the very rich and the corporate sector. So he has to keep them happy. They're more or less satisfied, so they allow him to continue. But the voting base is different. His voting base is, first of all, evangelical Christians, which is about 25% of the population. That's actually the popular base for his Middle East policies. Shifted enormously. Used to be liberal Democrats. Now it's shifted to the far right evangelicals and far right nationalists. That's of some importance for the future. So that's part of his voting base. The other large part is overwhelmingly men. He has strong support among men, rural, conservative, Christian, traditional, gun-loving, hate foreigners, hate blacks, white supremacists. That's always been a significant part of the society, but it's now encouraged by the government and has become very prominent. You can see it even in violent acts. The FBI keeps careful records of domestic terrorism. There isn't a lot in the United States, but there's some. When Trump came into office, about 10 or 15% was white supremacy. Now it's 100%. They're encouraged, militant, armed. There are armed militias which outgun the police and state troopers. And all of this has been encouraged by Trump to construct a voting base. And it's a very tricky operation he's carried off. He has to, on the one hand, carry out policies which serve the super rich and the corporate sector and harm the rest of the population. But meanwhile, he has to accumulate a voting base which will support him, and support him actually with adoration, the kind I haven't seen in my lifetime since the early 1930s. This worship of the ultimate leader and adoration of him, no matter what, is pretty remarkable. So even if Trump doesn't win the election, which is an open question, the poisons he's brought to the surface will be extremely hard to deal with.
If we were to speak of the changing dynamics within the establishment or between, phenomena that were represented by either Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders and the establishment. How can we explain this shift in dynamics? Has this happened, and to what extent? And what was the impact of this term, the presidential term of Donald Trump, on these dynamics?
Well, quite independently of Trump, there has been a substantial growth of basically social democratic, progressive sentiment among the general population. That's been going on for years. A lot of it was mobilized by the Sanders movement, which kind of provided an umbrella for lots of popular developments, mostly among young people, but not only those. Actually, you saw it pretty dramatically after the George Floyd murder. It was just another murder of a black man by the police, but this was quite different. There was a huge popular uprising. In fact, the largest social movement in American history developed very quickly with enormous participation all over the country, enormous popular support. About 2/3 of the population supported the Black Lives Matter protests, which is phenomenal. That's far more than the support that Martin Luther King had at the peak of his popularity. And it had constructive proposals. It's working in neighborhoods. It's a major movement developed. Now, it didn't come just but suddenly. That's a reflection of changes that have been taking place for some years. You can see it in many ways. So take, say, the New York Times, the main establishment. About a year ago, they ran a major series of kind of essay articles called the 1619 Project. 1619 was selected because that's when basically the first slaves were brought to the United States. It's 400 years of brutal, harsh repression, including the most vicious system of slavery in American history, which is a large part of the foundation of the wealth of the United States and Britain. Then after it, years of bitter, brutal repression continuing right to the present. Well, the 1619 series was an effort to expose this and, in fact, to place it at the center of American history. Caused quite a backlash, but the very fact that they did it is an indication of currents that are developing within the society, urging a more honest recognition of what the past has been and what kind of country they are. That's one thing that's happening. On the other hand, what's happening is the flames that are fanned by Donald Trump very consciously. Racism, white supremacy, reaction, Christian fundamentalism, this gathering sector, overwhelmingly male, a lot of misogyny involved, and so on. And that's, this split is very serious. It literally could lead to civil war. Remember that President Trump, who's basically a wrecker, his main policies are wreck everything. So if there's an international treaty, wreck it. If there's domestic democratic forms, wreck them. One of his programs has been to destroy and undermine functioning American democracy. So the executive branch has been purged entirely. Nobody left but sycophants. There were inspectors general established by Congress to monitor executive offices for malfeasance and corruption, they began to look into the swamp of corruption that Trump has created. So he simply fired them all. Okay, that's the kind of thing that only happens in small tin pot dictatorships where there's a military coup every couple of years. Just a few days ago, news was leaked that Trump is planning to fire almost the entire civil service. Hundreds of thousands of people who were kind of the permanent backbone of the government. Wants to get rid of them all, replace them all with Trump supporters. The final step is that he has said openly that if he doesn't like the outcome of the election, he'll just stay and surround himself with paramilitaries, armed supporters who'll just keep him in office. And this is taken very seriously all over the top of the establishment, major commentators, writers, press. And one of the most interesting examples was an open letter, which perhaps you saw, written by two retired senior military commanders, highly regarded military commanders, John Nagel, Paul Yingling. They wrote an open letter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's the top military commander in the country. The letter reminded him of the oath of office that he took, where he swore to defend the country against enemies, domestic and foreign. And they said, we are now facing a domestic enemy, a lawless president who has insisted that he'll remain in office and that he will protect himself with armed paramilitaries. And they went on to say, it is your responsibility as top military commander to defend the Constitution against this lawless president by sending a military force, they said a battalion of the 82nd Airborne Division, send it to forcefully disperse the armed militias and paramilitaries and forcefully remove him from office.
Professor Chomsky, Ali Saad is asking a question. The American press, Ali is saying, has recently described the presidential elections as a referendum for the presidency of Donald Trump rather than a competition between the president and Joe Biden. Do you view this the same way, in the sense that anyone is better than Trump? And do you think that the Democrats made a mistake by supporting Biden on the expense of a progressive candidate like Senator Bernie Sanders?
It's hard to think of anyone who is not preferable to Trump. In my opinion, this may sound outrageous, but it's true. He's actually the most dangerous figure in political history. And it's not because of the things we're talking about. I mean, destruction of American democracy would be serious enough, but it's not on the scale of destruction of organized human life on Earth. And that's what he's dedicated to. His climate policies, if they persist, will drive the species off the edge. He's leading almost the entire world is trying to do at least something about the impending environmental catastrophe, which is very serious. Trump alone is racing to the abyss. He wants to maximize the use of fossil fuels, open up new areas for drilling, even beyond what the energy corporations want, dismantling the regulatory system, which somewhat mitigates the effects of global warming and protects the population from mercury pollution, pollution of streams, and so on. Just this morning, they released 100 measures which he has eliminated. This man, 4 more years of Trump, might very well bring us to irreversible tipping points in heating of the climate. At the very least, they'll make it much harder to deal with the problem if he's removed somehow, to deal with it within the limited time available. We have a few decades in which we can take steps which will avert total catastrophe, okay? And it is total. It's an indescribable catastrophe. And it's known there are feasible ways to deal with it, can be dealt with, but there isn't much time. And Trump's major contribution to history is to take massive steps towards destroying organized human society on Earth. There's much more, but this is paramount. And he's, unfortunately, has a media echo chamber, which repeats everything he says. The major news channel, the one with the most viewers, is Fox News. Murdoch, very right-wing, simply amplifies everything he says. So if you look at Republicans, who that's all they listen to, it's almost half the population. About half of them don't even think that global warming is taking place. Maybe 20% think it's an urgent problem. This is extremely serious, much worse than his destruction of American democracy and the wreckage he's carrying out around the world.
You've recently published a book on climate change called Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal. You've said that the world is at the most dangerous moment in human history due to this crisis, due to this climate crisis. Could you please elaborate a bit on that, perhaps even link it to the current US foreign policy? I know you've addressed this just now, but if we were to pinpoint what the main issues or the main factors in this policy that exacerbate that, what can we say? How can we elaborate on that?
Well, let's take Lebanon and the Eastern Mediterranean. There are very careful studies by fine climate scientists. I don't know about the Arab world, but I followed it in Israel very closely. They have excellent climate scientists who've been working hard on this. They're trying to warn the government that they have to radically change their policies or else Israel will be destroyed. They're predicting that in several decades, the Eastern Mediterranean the sea will have heated up so high that in the summer months, it will reach the level of a jacuzzi. People won't be able to go into it in the summer. You can see what that does to the fish population and so on. And that means that much of Israel, the coastal plain, will be inundated. Jerusalem will survive. Ramallah will survive. They're up in the hills. All right, move that to Lebanon. Same thing. Meanwhile, Israel, Lebanon, major energy corporations are opening up new sources of fossil fuel development in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is, if anybody, if there is extraterrestrial intelligence watching what's happening on Earth, they'll think we're insane, totally insane.
Okay, so this is when it comes to, you were just referring to Palestine and Lebanon. I think Hisham has a question. Hisham, could you go ahead, please?
Sir, I think there was somebody before me though, Bashar, if I were not mistaken.
Bashar, yes, Bashar is asking, thank you, Hisham. Bashar is asking the following: what do you think about the claims of Professor Richard Wolff concerning the need to democratize the enterprise as a micro-level intervention in the organization of production within the context of cooperatives, in contrast to the traditional macro-level changes introduced through parliamentary reformations or revolutionary socialism? And how would such cooperatives survive in the competitive world of capitalism? Do you have any concrete examples which are worthy of studying and analyzing?
Well, they're very significant examples. Some were which have been around for a long time. Take Mondragon in the Basque Country in Spain. It's a huge conglomerate, worker-owned, worker-managed, industrial, hospitals, banks, residences. It's about the one part of the Spanish economy that survived the financial crash, doing quite well. Of course, it's within a what's called a capitalist world, a state capitalist world, so it has to deal with the surrounding environment, but it's been extremely successful. You turn to the United States, there's in the old Rust Belt, the areas that have been deindustrialized because of the neoliberal investor rights trade organization, which has deindustrialized large parts of the United States. Well, one of the things that's happening is the development of small worker-owned enterprises linked to the growing service economy. So in Cleveland, Ohio, for example, they used to be an industrial center. Now it's a service center, universities, health centers, high tech, and so on. But they need services, like they need laundries. They need other things providing services. Well, those are being developed and taken over by cooperatives and worker-owned enterprises. It's not huge, but it's substantial, and it's a basis for far more. In fact, if you think about it, there are a lot of possibilities if a significant lift develops. So if, take, say, the fossil fuel industries. Survival requires that they go out of business within a few decades. And we have to reach net zero emissions by mid-century if there's to be a decent chance of survival. That means the fossil fuel industries will have to be, first of all, phased out year by year. 5% a year, let's say, would bring us to net zero by mid-century, and then turn to other work. The same industries can be developing renewable energy. They have the capacity, the technology, the workforce. In fact, almost all of the oil majors, except ExxonMobil, have subsidiaries which work on renewable energy. They're profitable, but the big companies don't want to pursue them because they can make more money destroying the world. But if these industries were taken over, these industries could be bought by the government at current low prices very easily, and then not nationalized. We don't want to turn them into a Aramco. They should be socialized, placed under the control of the workforce, the community, who would be doing the work that's needed. Even things like capping wells, which release methane that the oil companies don't want to bother with, creating renewable energy resources. Many more jobs, a factor of 10 at least, much better jobs, saving the environment, could be done, and it could be worker-owned and managed. There are other examples like this. I'll give you one last one, which is critical. In 2009, the financial crash, the Obama administration essentially nationalized the American auto industry. It essentially took it over, bailed it out. It was in the hands of the government. Now, there were several possibilities. One was reconstituted, pay off the owners, put them back in office, have them continue to produce cars to clog the highways. That was what was taken. Suppose there'd been an organized left in the United States and a functioning labor movement. They could have called for something else. Okay, you own them, you own the auto industry, turn it over to the workforce and the community. We'll run it, and we'll do the kinds of things that are needed, not clog the highways with more cars, but create efficient mass transportation U.S. is very backward in that, very backward. Could create it, many more jobs, much better life. That was an option. What was missing was an organized activist left and labor movement. If they can be created, then those situations which are continually emerging can lead to the kind of cooperative, worker-owned, worker-managed industries, enterprises that the questioner was asking about. It's on the verge of possibility.
I think we can have Hisham's question now.
Yes, thank you. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Chomsky, for making the time to speak to us. I have one question and comment question. The first question is, to many people in this part of the world and for the majority of the peoples of this planet, when you say American democracy, it can sound like an oxymoron. Even to people within the United States, like the Black community who have suffered tremendously. And my question is about your focus on Trump. A lot of the damage that has been visited upon the globe has taken place prior to Trump's accession to power. We know that the drone system was initiated, or at least activated much more so under Obama. Ferguson broke out under Obama. The financial network, the financial sanctions that took place very much. So do you think at this juncture, focusing too much on Trump is undermining the structural elements that have led us to this place of no return? That's my first question. And I understand that you've said this under political realism, but aren't we at a point where the system is really irredeemable, and by simply playing this game of political realism, we are reinforcing it by voting for Biden? So that's my first question. The second comment question, since you've mentioned the coastal regions of so-called Israel, to many people like us who is in this region, it is offensive to our ears because this is the coast of Palestine. And you have been a long-time critic of Israel, and it's something that many people here appreciate. But lately, the question of BDS is something that you've opposed, and I won't ask you why because I've heard the reasons. I'm actually reaching out all the way from the border with Palestine to ask you whether you would reconsider your position, given that this is what the Palestinian civil society wants. And one thing about solidarity, even if some aspects may not be as convincing to you, then at least it's one gesture of support in light of the total collapse of the national project of Palestinian liberation and the absence of other opportunities. Wouldn't you say this is at least the very minimal position that one may take?
What are you referring to? I didn't catch what you're referring to.
I was referring to, and please correct me if I'm wrong, your opposition to BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And I am asking if you could reconsider, given the situation. I don't know, I don't want to repeat what I said. Were you able to listen to the rest of it, or would you like me to repeat?
Oh, I understood. I just want, I thought that's what you're saying, but I wanted to be sure. So these are two big questions. I'll answer them. I'll answer the first one quickly and then turn to the second. The first question is Trump, is everything Trump's fault? Obviously not. Trump is simply carrying to a crazed extreme very serious policies. Let's just take the last 40 years. I don't want to go back to the origins of modern capitalism. We have been through 40 years of a radical economic experiment, neoliberal experiment, which has been very harmful to populations all over the world, everywhere, including the United States. So just to take the United States as it's the most prominent and important example because of its power and its role internationally. There was just a study that came out by one of the major research institutions, the Rand Corporation, very respectable, asking how much wealth was transferred from the working class and the middle class, the lower 90% of the population, how much wealth was transferred from them to the very rich during the 40 neoliberal years? Answer, $47 trillion transferred from the working class and the poor to the very rich during these 40 years. That's pre-Trump, okay? That was definite, explicit policies designed for that purpose, and it has achieved it. Same thing has happened in Europe. It's caused anger, resentment, collapse of centrist institutions, provides fertile terrain for the rise of demagogues like Trump, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, like Orban in Hungary, many Salvini in Italy, many others. Yes, that's pre-Trump, okay? Trump has taken it and turned it from a crisis into an utter catastrophe. So there's a lot to redo, and even before that, a lot to say about that. But instead of saying it, of going on, let me turn to your second question. First of all, we cannot deny the existence of the state of Israel. Things you don't like don't disappear if you say, I don't like them, okay? They're there whether you like them or not. So it's there. Let's take the methods that can be used to rectify the terrible situation of the Palestinians. There are methods. So boycott and divestment are a very sensible message. There are no sanctions, so let's talk about boycott and divestment. I've actually been in favor of it since long before the BDS movement was formed. It was actually initiated in the late 1990s by Uri Avneri and his Gush Shalom movement in Israel, which called for a program of boycott and divestment from anything related to the occupied territories. That's a very sound policy, can gain lots of support. It's actually been successful. So for example, in the United States, one of the largest church groups, Presbyterian Church, accepted boycott and divestment from anything connected to the territories, including the multinational, US-based multinational corporations involved in the territories. The human rights groups have called for it and so on. Very successful policy. It's had effects, could have more effects if it was conducted more seriously. That's not the BDS movement. The BDS movement includes boycotting, divestment from the territories, and in that there have been successes, but it asks for more. If you want a movement that's going to succeed, you have to face realities. You can't live in a dream world. Activists understand in other movements that you have to adapt your tactics to the real world that exists, not to some imaginary world that doesn't exist. So for example, one part of the BDS movement is the call to allow all refugees to return. Well, I think that would be a nice thing, but it's not going to happen. Not only is it not going to happen, but to raise it is suicidal. It's simply telling your enemies, it's simply handing a weapon to your enemies, saying, oh, you're anti-Semitic, you want to destroy Israel, you're calling for Israel to be replaced by Palestinians. It's not going to happen. You're anti-Semitic, we'll set up laws to stop you from functioning. Then the BDS movement gets diverted away from the rights and concerns of Palestinians to fighting legal battles against discriminatory laws and defending itself from charges of anti-Semitism. Actually, the same is true of the call for the third plank in the platform, the call for removing harsh discriminatory rules within Israel. It's the right thing to do, but as a tactic, it's suicidal, because predictably it leads to the reaction that says, why are you picking Israel? Why don't you pick your own country, the United States, which has very severe discriminatory laws? So if you're going to boycott Tel Aviv University because of discriminatory laws in Israel, why not boycott Harvard because of discriminatory laws in the United States? Okay? People who try to develop a movement that will achieve results ask tactical questions. They say, how can I shape my tactics to reach the goals that I want? They don't say, how can I shape my tactics so I can feel good? Okay? That's not politics. And unfortunately, the BDS movement has fallen into that. So my critique of the movement is that it is picking suicidal tactics. Now, in fact, there are realistic tactics that could work and are being ignored because of the insistence on repeating the suicidal tactics which divert attention away from Palestinian rights and concerns. There are many. There have been significant demographic changes in the United States, very significant ones. You go back 10 or 20 years, the center of support for Israel in the United States was liberal Democrats. Israel was considered the social democratic darling of the liberal world in the United States and Europe too. That's totally changed. Among liberal people who identify themselves as Democrats, there's actually more support for Palestinians than Israel now. This is especially true among younger people, including, incidentally, younger Jews who are just dropping out. The center of support for Israel has shifted to the far right, to evangelicals and to right-wing ultranationals. Now that opens possibilities. One crucial possibility has to do with Israeli nuclear weapons. Now, let me point out something very striking that doesn't get discussed. In the United States, it's claimed long before Trump, Obama, Bush, that the greatest threat to world peace is Iran's programs of nuclear development. It's fake, but let's assume that it's true. Suppose that Iranian nuclear weapons development is a problem, serious problem. Is there a way to deal with it? Very simple way, very simple. Establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region with extensive inspection and investigations, which can work. We have seen it working during the period of the Iran agreement. Even American intelligence accepts it. So fine, let's move to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone, then no Iranian problem. Is there a barrier to that? Not the Arab states. They've been calling for it for 25 years. Not Iran, which is calling for it vigorously. Not the global south, G77, 130 countries, strongly in favor of it. Europe in favor of it. What blocks it? The United States. Every time it comes up for discussion at international meetings, it's vetoed by the United States. Last time was by Obama, 2015. It's coming up again in another couple of months. The United States will veto it. Why? Because the United States does not want Israeli nuclear weapons to be inspected internationally. In fact, the United States refuses to admit that Israel has nuclear weapons. Of course, everyone knows it, but they can't officially admit it. And there's a reason for that. It's called U.S. law. U.S. law requires that if a country develops nuclear weapons outside the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, U.S. military and economic aid has to terminate. Neither political party wants to open that door. The media won't discuss it. but popular movements could press it. There's enough of a popular base so that if there was a genuine Palestinian solidarity movement, a genuine one, looking for tactics that will succeed, it could put this issue right at the center of the agenda and get plenty of popular support. There are a lot of Americans all over across the spectrum who don't like the idea of foreign aid altogether. They don't know what's going on. But a popular movement could get them to know. It could get them to know that the United States is willing to face a possible major war in the Middle East, a threat with Iran, in order to keep illegal U.S. aid going to Israel. Okay? That's something that could be pressed if there were a genuine solidarity movement. There are other things. The U.S. aid, military aid to Israel, is illegal under what's called the Leahy Law, a law that requires termination of military aid to any military force engaged in systematic human rights abuses. Well, the IDF certainly is. Bringing that to the fore would be another sensible tactic. Okay? There are things that could be done that would be very beneficial to Palestinian rights. They're not being done because the BDS movement insists on suicidal tactics. That's my objection.
Just to clarify, sorry, this will be my last interjection. No worries, because I understand this is your platform. I wasn't asking a question. I'm well aware of your position, and I do find it unconvincing and contradictory because capitalism has been here for 4 centuries. If we want to overcome it, we dream of a different world. Apartheid in South Africa is also another case in point. The BDS has very concrete objectives. They're asking for a secular one-state solution. And by the way, Dr. Salman Abu Sitta has conducted a study to show that the right of return of refugees will not impact Israel the way it's being portrayed. There's still enough space for everybody, Jew and Arab and everybody else, to live there, practically speaking. And Ramallah, by the way, is in the occupied Palestinian territories. It's in Palestine. So anyways, this was just an appeal. And I don't think anybody here in this group denies that Israel exists. The question is, do we want an apartheid Israel or do we want something else? Thank you.
I would like some, for 80 years, I have been in favor of a secular Palestine, okay? I'm still in favor of it. But I also live in this world. I want tactics that can succeed, not that will be suicidal. Now, in my life, I've been involved with many third world nationalist movements. Every single one, except for the Palestinians, has understood that you have to adapt your tactics to the real world, not what you would like to see, but what can be done and can get to what you would like to see. So the Vietnamese were making compromises all over the place. I can go through the record, but they understood that you're going to have to compromise with the real world. Maybe ultimately you can get to what you want, but you have to face what exists now. Same is true of the Central American movements. Same was true of the anti-apartheid movement. They worked for decades to get to a point that the Palestinians haven't begun to reach. I mean, they were by the boycott of South Africa in the United States began around 1980. That was after the United Nations had called off all arms aid. That was at a point where U.S. corporations wanted to pull out of apartheid South Africa. At that point, you could have an effective boycott movement, okay? That's because the African National Congress wanted to achieve results that required compromise, regular steps. If you want to say, look, this is what I want, I'm not going to develop tactics that'll lead to it. I'm just going to develop tactics that take positions about what I want. You're committing suicide. Now, the Palestinians have been unfortunate, and that's what they, first the PLO, I talk about that, later Palestinian movements, have simply been unwilling to do what every third world nationalist movement has done. Adjust your tactics so that they can succeed, not so that they're suicidal. So it's perfectly possible in an academic seminar to convince yourself that all the refugees can return and there's plenty of room.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. I appreciate your response. Again, I don't want to get this into, I made my point and I appreciate your response.
Yeah.
May I ask, before we move to discussing foreign policy, I have a couple of questions also regarding this argument. Professor Chomsky, do you not think that this kind of also dismisses the argument that the foundational pillars of Israel were discriminatory in the first place? This is number one. And number two, is this argument not does it not submit to the often intentional confusion between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
Well, this was invented, this idea that there's no difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Its origins actually are from Abba Eban, in the West, very highly regarded Israeli statesman, foreign minister of Israel, back in the early 1970s, which was a crucial period in Israel-Palestine relations. In the early 70s, he wrote a major article in the leading liberal Zionist journal in the United States, the Journal of the American Jewish Congress. That's the liberal part of the community. He wrote an article in which he said, your duty as American Jews is to make it clear that there is no distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, where anti-Zionism meant the policies of the government for which he was foreign minister. That's your job. And he even gave two examples of people who they have to expose because they're anti-Semites, because of their critique of Israel. One of the two was I.F. Stone, who was a dedicated Zionist, but very critical of the policies of Israel. So he's an anti-Semite. The other was me, okay, because I was critical of the policies of Israel, so therefore I'm an anti-Semite. And he said, these two people are suffering from a neurotic complex of guilt because Jews have survived. And it's the task of American Jews to expose this anti-Semitism. Later it was picked up by others. For example, it was just used in England recently by a massive campaign which went across the spectrum all the way to the Guardian and the Parliamentary Labour Party to destroy Corbyn because he was trying to create a genuine, popular-based Labour Party. And they couldn't tolerate that. So they launched a campaign again about anti-Semitism, and they managed to destroy him. So yes, that's there, and you have to combat it, of course.
Okay, then just again to further clarify my comment, and perhaps I think, I'm assuming this is what partly my colleague Hisham was referring to. Is it just about the policies? Is it not about the, again, foundational elements of of Israel in the first place? Is it really just about policies and tactics and counter-tactics?
Is what?
Is the problem only with regard to policy, Israeli policy,
long term? Take the problems that Ho Chi Minh faced in Vietnam in 1950. The long-term goal that he was interested in was getting a free, independent Vietnam. Okay, that was the goal. But he was a realistic figure who wanted the best for the Vietnamese. So he therefore compromised. He accepted a division of the country into two zones, anticipating that in the longer term, this could be overcome. Then there were other compromises. The National Liberation Front of South Vietnam called for neutralizing South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia as a step towards their further goals. And it goes on like this step after step. Every successful nationalist movement, without exception, South Africa, Mozambique, India, Vietnam, you pick it, has always acted this way. The Palestinians refuse. They say, what I want is this, and I'm not going to take steps to achieve it.
Okay,
in fact, I'm going to take steps which harm the achievement of it. That's suicidal.
I think this discussion could drag on further, so this is why possibly it's better to maybe shift to another topic or subtopic relating to American.
ربيع أنا حطيت شيء. I posted something. I just asked, but I mean, isn't this what Arafat did?
Sorry.
Yeah, so Mariam's asking, isn't it like this realism, what you're referring to as realism, isn't this what Arafat did in the 1990s and ended up assassinated?
Partly. It's partly what he did, but there were major gaps. You all know Edward Said, old personal friend of mine. From the 1970s, he was desperately trying to get the Palestinian National Council to move towards taking significant actions that could lead to moving towards a political settlement, not the optimal one, but one which could be reached. Well, finally in 1988, the Council and PLO agreed on a Declaration of Independence in which they said they would accept the board, they would recognize, there would be mutual recognition, and they would accept the borders of the partition resolution of 1947. Okay, well, that was a step forward, but several flaws. One, it was 20 years late. Two, the borders of 1947 were no longer attainable. Any realistic analysis could understand that. But third, and most important, and this is what Edward was particularly upset about, we actually worked on this together for many years, was the absolute refusal of the PLO to try to help develop a solidarity movement within the United States. We had I could describe to you meetings that we had with the top Palestinian leaders when they came to New York to go to the United Nations. If we had time, I would describe them. But they were a disaster. They simply refused, like distinct from any other nationalist group I've dealt with, they refused to take the steps that could lead now to a genuine solidarity movement, which would make advantage of the opportunities that exist and move forward.
Okay, maybe we could move on to another question regarding American foreign policy, because I'm assuming that most of us here kind of believe that this relates also to power dynamics and power relations rather than any other element in this regard. Regarding American foreign policy, especially now, 4 years after Trump being president, would you say that we might be having a change in the administration if Biden is elected? Would you say that there is a major difference between the Democrats and the Republicans regarding Middle Eastern issues, especially when it comes to, enforced, if I may say, normalization with Israel, and on the other hand, the sanctions that are imposed on different countries in the Middle East, primarily Iran and Syria.
Will there be a difference?
Would there be a difference? Yeah.
Yes, I think one of the major differences, crucial, is that a Biden administration is susceptible to popular pressures. Let's not fall into the trap, the establishment trap, of thinking that elections are the be-all and end-all of politics. They're not. Politics, real politics, means constant, engaged activism, and it can have effects. On the Trump administration, no effect. They're totally immune to it. They're pursuing a different policy, which I'll describe in a moment, but is immune to public pressure. A Democratic administration may not want it, but they are susceptible to public pressure. In fact, even Reagan and Nixon were susceptible to public pressure. Trump is something different, not susceptible. I can easily give you many examples to illustrate that. So under a Biden administration, it would be possible for an activist, organized public following realistic and effective tactics to lead to a change in policy. Under Trump, it's hopeless. What is Trump's policy? Well, out of the chaos of Washington, it is possible to discern pretty clear geostrategic programs. One of them is to create a reactionary international, an international of the most reactionary states in the world, to serve as the basis for U.S. power, dominated by the White House, by the Trump administration. Picks the most reactionary states in the world. In the Western Hemisphere, Brazil, major country in Latin America, under a kind of a Trump clone, Jair Bolsonaro. So that's undermining Brazilian democracy, moving towards military dictatorship. So that's the core part in the Western Hemisphere. In the Middle East, the basis of the policy is the Gulf states, the most reactionary, backward states in the world, the family dictatorships of the Gulf, now with MBS as their main leader. That's a core part. Al-Sisi's Egypt. Trump has declared that Al-Sisi is his favorite dictator. The Egyptian brutal dictatorship is a natural part. Israel's a natural part, shifted so far to the right that it's a core part of the reactionary alliance. The current agreements, mistakenly called peace agreements, they have nothing to do with that. The agreements between Israel and the ultra-reactionary Arab states are a very natural development of this. They have, of course, these relations have existed for a long time under the surface. Now they're becoming public as part of the basis for the deeply reactionary international. That's the meaning of the so-called Abraham agreements. To the east, Narendra Modi's India is a core part of the alliance, destroying Indian secular democracy, turning India into a Hindu racist ethnocracy, and crushing hundreds of millions of Muslims, destroying Kashmir, raised the already pretty brutal occupation into a monstrosity. So they're a core part of the alliance. In Europe, it includes people like Orban in Hungary, destroying Hungarian democracy, turning it into a kind of dictatorship. Figures like Matteo Salvini in Italy, very likely to assume power. bitterly a sordid creature who gets his enjoyment out of watching refugees die in the Mediterranean, blocking the refugees, imposing a reactionary regime. So the idea is to, and there's more like it, try to construct an alliance like that. That's serious. That's a real geostrategic program. There's no reason to believe that the Democrats would pursue that. Not that, I don't like their policies. I think they're awful, but they wouldn't pursue that. And furthermore, they would be susceptible to public pressures if they would be organized in an effective way, which goes back to the earlier discussion. So yes, there's a difference.
Yeah, there is a difference. Regarding the sanctions policies, would you say, would you expect them to be the same?
No.
Sanctions.
In fact, we know they would be different. Notice the sanctions policy. I mean, it's bad enough. It shouldn't exist altogether. It's a shocking horror, but there's a difference. And we just saw it dramatically. A couple of weeks ago, the Trump administration went to the United Nations Security Council and requested the council to reinstitute the UN sanctions against Iran, which had lapsed. The council refused, total refusal. All US allies opposed it, okay? The only country that get to support it is a client state, Colombia. Everyone else said no. So what happened? Secretary of State Mike Pompeo returned to the Security Council and informed them that the UN sanctions are being reinstituted. Doesn't matter what you say. We say they're being reinstituted. So now they are now reinstituted. That's raw US power. Bad as the Democrats are, that would never have happened under the Democrats. They have some willingness to deal with allies, okay? This is a unique phenomenon, unique in political history in the West. You see it in small dictatorships elsewhere. But it's the first time in 350 years of parliamentary democracy in England, 250 years in the United States. It's the first time that you've seen this kind of power play. And it's the same with others. Take the longest running sanctions against Cuba. It's a criminal action by all administrations. It goes back to Kennedy. But Obama, under public pressure, began to relax them. And under more public pressure, could have moved further. Trump, as soon as he came into office, made them harsher and more brutal, okay? Those are big differences, and they show up all over.
You think things are changing in Latin America recently?
Well, Latin America is a complicated story. There was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, development of what was called the pink tide, kind of moderately leftist governments taking over in country after country. Most important one was Brazil. The Lula da Silva government was the best government that Brazil's ever had. Even the World Bank regards it as what they call a golden decade in Brazil's history. But they made serious errors. One error was they tolerated corruption. Corruption's endemic in not only in Latin America, but also in the United States. Massive corruption. The Workers' Party joined it and totally discredited themselves. They've lost support in the country largely because they joined in the massive corruption of the right wing. That was a terrible mistake. Second mistake, they did not organize among the population. They just governed from above. They created no popular basis. It's at a point, one of the programs, I follow this pretty closely. My wife happens to be Brazilian also, so that's another reason, but I've been there many times. And I was close to the Lula government. one of the measures by the Lula government was what's called the Bolsa Familia. It gave subsidies to poor people for food, for buy a car, start a business, whatever it may be. But they never organized enough so that people actually knew where it was coming from. Now, there are polls now in Brazil where they ask people, where did the Bolsa Familia come from? The top answer is God. The second answer is luck, not the Workers' Party, because they didn't even do enough organization on the ground so that the popular base could be participating in these actions. It was just handed down. Third thing they did was fail to diversify the economy. They relied on the commodity boom. So they turned into a raw material producer, importing Chinese manufacturers. Same happened in Venezuela. Chavez did many decent things, but he never diversified the economy. It stayed a neo-colonial oil-based economy. When oil prices declined, they were in serious trouble. He himself was not involved in corruption, but he tolerated it, and that undermined the popular base. So there were very serious mistakes that were made. I think there's a good chance that something like the pink tide will come back, but they'll have to overcome their errors. If you want to have popular support, you have to earn it. Okay.
You're talking about the whole of Latin America, not just Brazil.
What?
You're referring to the whole of Latin America, not just Brazil. The possibility of the comeback of the
Venezuela, Peru, Argentina. It's a lot of the Latin America.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not sure if we have any more questions. I think this would be it.
Okay.
Okay, Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us in this session. Professor Asaf as well, thank you for coordinating that. And thank you everyone for joining, and have a good night.
Thanks.